Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It looks like we still do have a few people joining in, so we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jessica Stencliffe, and I'm Director of Marketing at Accudata Systems. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to our second bi-monthly PCI QSA webinar. Before we get started this morning, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, because this is a live Q&A, please feel free to start asking your questions immediately in the chat window in your browser. We did receive 4 questions during the registration process, so we'll address those first and then open up the floor. If we are unable to get to your question today, our QSAs will be emailing you individually to answer your questions. Please allow 48 to 72 hours for those responses. After the webinar, each attendee will receive a post-event email with both our full and recorded webinar and a copy of the slides. Today, we're joined by 2 extremely knowledgeable experts who are here to help address your toughest challenges around maintaining PCI compliance. First, I'd like to welcome Tim Stills. Tim is a risk and compliance consultant at Accudata and has more than 20 years of experience in IT security, audit, compliance, operations, and consulting. Tim routinely performs security assessments and penetration attacks and has been performing cardholder security assessments since Visa's release of CISP. He holds numerous certifications, having become a CISSP in 2001 and has been a QSA since 2005, and most recently an AWS Solutions Architect Associate. We're also pleased to welcome Michael Berry. Michael is a risk and compliance solutions architect with over 30 years of information systems and technology experience going back to mainframes. His experience also includes IT management, strategy, security, networking, software development, and risk and compliance. Michael has been with Accudata for 11 years and has been a QSA since 2012. In his time at Accudata, Michael has developed, managed, and participated in numerous projects to help a broad cross-section of Accudata clients meet and maintain PCI compliance. So with that, thank you all again for joining us, and let's get started with our first question. So this first question is going to go to Tim. All right, so is Cisco ACI, or application-centric infrastructure, sufficient to reduce CDE scope when applied correctly?
Hey, Jessica, and hey, thanks everyone for joining. So in regards to the Cisco ACI, my understanding is that this works at layers 4 through 7 of the OSI model. This means, though, that the underlying operating system and a network layer will likely be more susceptible to vectors of attack still. And so using this as a defense in depth is fine, but by itself, it's likely to not be able to enforce the required segmentation that we normally look to require for customer environments.
Thanks, Tim. And is there anything you'd like to add, Michael?
Yeah, I would just kind of reiterate some of what Tim was saying. We don't see it as a cure for everything. I think it potentially can reduce scope in some ways and make easier to meet and maintain PCI requirements. But in the end, I don't think it resolves all the issues regarding scope segmentation. As far as our understanding, Cisco ACI has some aspects of a software-defined networking, but it does not address all the PCI scope issues, as Tim noted.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Tim. All right, so we'll go ahead and move on to our next question here. How does the new release from the PCI Council affect my compliance, and what should I be doing to prepare for PCI 3.2 in 2018?
So Jessica,
Michael?
I'll take that to start with. Version 3.2 has been announced for a while, and there are a number of controls that will go into effect starting February 1st, 2018. I think from our perspective, we considered a lot of those best practices that people were already doing. There are several that are focused on service providers that have increased the requirements for service providers, but there are also a handful that address for both merchants and service providers. Most of those are pretty straightforward. I think the most significant change will be one that's actually comes due in June 31st of 2018 regarding merchants and service providers must stop the use of old versions of SSL and the early TLS communications protocols. Tim, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, actually, on that last thing you just mentioned, so from what we've seen, at least what I've seen in different environments, the TLS support issue is one of the bigger ones, only because several customers I've interacted with, they've got legacy applications, and so quite frankly, they can't just flip a switch and disable support for the older versions of SSL and TLS and immediately support the newer versions only because the application doesn't support it. So I know we've got two folks, unfortunately, that they're struggling with having to do a forklift upgrade. So I think that's kind of one of the bigger ones. The other ones, like you said, right, are kind of manageable from a control perspective, and many customers are already doing some of those requirements. But no doubt, support for the legacy versions are definitely going to be a problem, given the application upgrades that are going to likely be required for some customers.
Tim, specifically around this question, what types of timelines should clients be looking at in terms of updating and managing those controls prior to February 1st?
Well, certainly folks that we've already been interacting with, when we've engaged them in the last year, we were already advising them of this. And even when I just recently wrapped up an assessment and sent out a gentle reminder of the things to be working on. So the things that are just around the corner, like I said, for the February 1st deadline are pretty manageable, I think, and certainly for the guidance that we've been providing. But the other item, the TLS deadline later in the year, those are things that have to already be in the pipeline and people need to be working on now.
Fantastic. Thank you both. We'll go ahead and move on to our third question here. So as a service provider, I have a customer that does not want to accept my SAQ. What steps should I take to manage their expectations? Tim, can you take this one?
Yeah, we've run into this on occasion, and the best response there is that, the recommendation has been for the service provider to go back to the customer and simply show them, right, what are their documentation requirements, what is it that they need to be reporting to, and even go so far as if they have something, if they receive something from Visa that said what their reporting expectations are, to even share that with the customer, so that they could level set that and set the expectation for the customer in terms of what is it that they're really required to report on. And I think, unfortunately, the customers and probably their own QSAs are saying, hey, look, this service provider is not listed as an approved service provider. I can't find them, thus they're not compliant. So with that said, I think if they can just kind of educate them on, hey, at minimum, this is what's required, You may ask, though, why it is maybe someone isn't listed. And we have had customers that have only wanted us to do a gap assessment of their environment, and they felt that it wasn't a requirement to have a level 1 on-site assessment done, and it really wasn't something that was a requirement for their own business process. So, and if it's not required, then, they can go ahead and do their own self-assessment. But yeah, I think just showing what the minimum requirements are and what the expectations are of them should hopefully put them on the right path.
Perfect. So, Michael, anything you want to add?
Yeah, because we've run into this recently with a few customers who are service providers. And unfortunately, I think in the end, there is, beyond just PCI, there's a contractual relationship between the service provider and their customers. And, if the customer is going to require the service provider to be attested for compliance by a QSA and receive an attestation of compliance, then that's the customer's prerogative. And so, we've seen this with some service providers we have worked with, where in the end, the service provider has to sit down and kind of make a business justification. Do they want to spend the money, required to get a full assessment and attestation, and to keep the customer business that they want? And in many cases, they end up going that route because, it's critical to their business. So I think that's kind of where you draw the line there, is if the customer is going to require the service provider to be a fully attested, then they're going to have to go that route.
Fantastic. Thanks, Michael. We appreciate it. We're going to go ahead and go on to our final question that was submitted prior to the webinar today, and then we'll move on to our live questions. So our final question today is, I have multiple business locations around the world that accept credit card information, but I don't know what my scope really is. How do I start determining my true PCI scope? Michael, can you start us off on this one?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting question because it brings into a lot of different facets. When we look at doing an assessment, you're always looking at, not only where the credit card information is accepted, but how does it flow into the organization? Where is it processed? Is it stored anywhere? And quite frequently, in an international situation, that can be in a variety of locations. Servers can be hosted anywhere in the world. So what we have to really sit down and do is kind of what we call a scope review, and we map out where that cardholder data flows and how it's utilized. Some of the questions that come on, are there anything that's outsourced, or all the facilities owned by the organization? What technologies are in use, and how are cards accepted? Is it through voice or fax? We've seen where customers have call centers overseas, so that creates scope questions. All those aspects come into play. You have to look at where the information is transmitted, and a lot of times you end up using service providers for some of this. So it does require a full review of the scope, and in some cases, things, like I said, may be accepted in one region, but then stored and processed in a different region.
Hey, Michael, it reminds me of, you mentioned these different regions, so also, too, keep in mind, the QSAs have to be authorized for the different regions. So Accudata, we're authorized for work within the U.S. So even if the entity is headquartered in the U.S., any process that might be outside of that, even if you're not going to visit, because we recently went through this, you have to be authorized to conduct work in that region. So in our case, we actually partnered with a QSA company that covered Canada and Latin America for a company that had call centers in those locations. So food for thought on that if you do have operations worldwide, then certainly the organization has to be authorized, or it can partner with someone that can cover those remote locations as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, but I think also a good point to make clear is that the PCI data security standard is identical in all regions. The same requirements that we apply in all regions. It's just where those QSA companies are kind of authorized to attest to compliance that you're speaking to.
Yep.
Thank you both. We appreciate it. So we do have a couple of questions that have come in here from our audience today. So let me go ahead and open it up to our live Q&A portion of the webinar. The first question we have is, my business is required to store card information, and we're wondering what technology to use. What are your thoughts on encryption versus tokenization? Tim, you want to go ahead and take that one?
Sure. Yeah. I think the easy answer on that one is tokenization. Assuming that it can't be reversed, it's a one-way tokenization. That would be the optimum because that way it's no longer considered cardholder data. For sure, if it's even encrypted cardholder data, it's still categorized as such and needs to be handled and managed by it. So if you look within the PCI DSS, it'll clarify that. So whether it's encrypted, not encrypted, it's still treated the same. So yeah, I would definitely say tokenize the data. We see that a lot nowadays where people, as soon as they get it, they tokenize it, and that's what then is transmitted throughout their environment, the token value.
Thanks, Tim. Michael, anything you want to add on that one?
Yeah, I think, we've seen a lot of organizations really moving to tokenization in the last couple of years because it goes hand in hand with some other kind of initiatives that have been going on in the credit card world, and specifically the use of point-to-point encryption at point-of-sale systems where, the card information is immediately encrypted upon swipe, and the retailer or merchant never has the credit card information. It's sent out to a processor, and the merchant receives the token back. The same thing applies to a lot of e-commerce websites now, where when the customer goes to make a payment, they're really redirected to a third-party payment processor site. So the merchant has never really got their hands on the credit card. All they have is a token that represents the credit card, but it's not something I could use to, steal anything with. So those two things, I think, have helped drive the move to tokenization, and it's certainly something that we've recommend to our customers to investigate. If at all possible, don't store credit card information because it just opens up so many more requirements that you have to meet, and it, opens you up to a potential much greater for being hacked and having credit card information stolen.
Thank you, Michael. All right, so the next question we have live here is, my company has started using a loyalty program that accepts payments in a mobile application. What new security measures should I expect, and how do I ensure that I maintain compliance through that mobile application?
So, Jessica, I can speak to that. We've been actually working with a rather large retailer chain that's doing this, and you really, it's just extending the PCI scope to a new application, a new area. It can actually bring the mobile device into scope, whether it's a phone or a tablet or whatever, because in reality, there's different ways that those devices can interact with the cardholder data environment. Sometimes they are, just a web browser component that's integrated into the app, and everything's being transmitted back and forth to a remote server. But there are situations we've seen where there's actually a full mobile application on the device that is potentially storing credit card information. So these need to be considered as in scope, and they have to be reviewed just like other PCI in scope systems. And we've actually been doing more mobile application pen testing in recent years because of that, because of the popularity of these things.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point, and I can attest to that. So I had actually recently done a pen test of a native application. So from what I saw was that I'd worked with developers that were third-party. It was a third-party provider that the marketing department had interacted with and hired, and so this was done totally outside of IT, and so they coordinated with this mobile application vendor to create the application. And so we came along and assessed the application, and so it was a vertical. Unfortunately, it was a vertical learning curve for the vendor because OWASP top 10 or even just application security controls and secure coding practices wasn't really on their radar. So unfortunately, this is one of those things where you kind of want to make sure that the left hand knows the right hand exists, and that there's communication within the company. So no doubt, it's going to be a matter of making sure that whoever it is that's doing the application development, they're up to speed on various requirements and PCI requirements, and because this is now going to get pulled in under the umbrella of a PCI assessment. So it's best to get in front of that as soon as you can rather than later on.
Great advice. Thank you, Tim and Michael. The next question that we're going to move on to is, you had mentioned scope reduction of the CDE using Cisco ACI. I'm going to give this one to Tim. Can you give any additional examples of opportunities that we commonly recommend to reduce the cardholder data environment that are fairly straightforward and effective?
Yeah, I mean, the knee-jerk response to that is normally, right, it's been using firewalling devices, but it's not always practical, especially in a distributed environment. We've seen, especially within, hospital environments where, there have to be workstations that are on multiple floors and multiple buildings across a campus. And so even using something like HIPs, so intrusion devices or applications, so both at a firewall level and as well as an intrusion level. So some of those products that are deployed on those workstations, we've used that as a means to be sufficient to isolate those. So it may not be practical to be able to carve out that workstation on a given use that to control around both coming and going and getting access to that given workstation isn't effective as well.
Michael, anything else that you've seen commonly used to reduce that CDE?
Yeah, I would tell you that another thing we see is the use, in some cases, of virtual terminals or Citrix devices. In that, what you do there is, the application is really not running on the local workstation or, kind of dumb terminal, I wouldn't call it that. They're, but they don't really have, they only have one function. Then the end user is just there running the application and can only enter information into that application. So those devices don't have as many controls in terms of, file integrity monitoring or, antivirus or things like that. And, the apps are, like I said, they're being hosted in a central server and they're all managed there. And really the user is just seeing a screen and entering the screen. So that's, I think, a common thing we've seen a lot here, especially like in call centers in place where you have a lot of users all sitting there together using the same app, but they just need separate terminals to it.
Great. Thank you both. At this point, we've addressed all of the live questions for the webinar. Tim or Michael, anything that you'd like to leave the audience with in terms of preparation for 3.2 and food for thought as they continue to maintain compliance and manage their compliance over the coming months?
Yeah, I think you can't get started on it soon enough, right? So don't wait till somebody shows up before, a month or two before your anniversary date. So try to get in front of it as soon as you can. For sure, also make sure you're staying on top of those things that need to be done on a daily, quarterly, biannual, annual basis. So it's pretty hard to kind of go back and recover from things that should have been done, whether they be wireless scans, vulnerability scans, and now we've got coming up where you need to be doing biannual pen tests. So I think, definitely maintaining then doing the housekeeping that you need to be doing on a routine basis definitely helps as well. Makes it a lot easier for us, right? If you've got that information, you've got that data, and it's stored so that when somebody shows up, whether it's us or another QSA, it's easy to present that to them, and it makes it the engagement a lot easier and typically a lot shorter as well. Michael, anything?
Yeah, I think the point that you kind of made there, the ongoing things, I think that was one of the, besides a few of the technical things like we talked about with the SSL and TLS, but that, I think that was a lot of the emphasis in three, DSS version 3 and 3.2 is that PCI is an ongoing effort. It's not a point in time, your QSA shows up once a year and checks in, you're good. This needs to be integrated, into your daily business processes that, PCI and credit card security is something that's always in the forefront of organizations that have to, store, accept credit card information. And so I think that was a key thing that they emphasized there because there had been cases in the past where organizations tended to kind of look at PCI as a one time a year thing to worry about, and then they kind of forgot about it. So I think that was an emphasis there.
Great. Michael and Tim, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it, and thank you to all who attended the webinar today. As a reminder, you're each going to receive a post-event email very shortly after the webinar where you're going to be able to download several resources to help you prepare for 3.2, as well as watch a recorded version of the webinar and download the slides. Additionally, if you do have any questions, don't forget that you can submit those by replying to the email address when you do receive your post-event email, as well as emailing your Accudata account manager or Accudata primary contact directly. Again, we appreciate your time. Hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you.